I originally had a James Bond idea, but then I thought of another idea better, so I'm pitching the other idea first. Hello everybody and welcome back to Pitch This here on the MrEliMac channel. I'm your host, MrEliMac, and Pitch This is the show where I pitch a movie or TV show that I really want to see out there in the world. And if you like the concept of the show, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. That way you can be up to date with all the videos that I have here. Also hit the notification bell, that way you can be notified whenever a new video like this goes live. And so, as I promised, I said I was going to be doing a James Bond reboot pitch, but when I was thinking through all the ideas that I could do to make it fresh and innovative, I really couldn't think of anything that was fresh or innovative. So instead, I'm not going to be doing a James Bond pitch. No, I was talking to my dad earlier today, and that's when a sort of TV show idea came to mind, and I haven't actually pitched a TV show idea to you all yet, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have this be my first TV show pitch, and it's going to be an idea that takes three of my loves together. My love for TV, my love for movies, and my love for wrestling. So I'm going to be pitching a wrestling TV show that I think would be very interesting, and it is going to be in the vein of sort of American Horror Story or American Crime Story, where each season is a different show or a different concept, where in American Horror Story, like, each season is a different themed horror thing, and in American Crime Story, it's sort of based off of a new book each season and a different type of crime. You know, season 1 was the OJ, and then season 2 was Versace, etc., etc. So this show is going to be a show that I am calling American Wrestling Story, and each season is going to be dedicated to a different wrestler in the world of professional wrestling. And again, if you like this idea, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel as I get more TV show ideas out there. So without any further ado, let's get into the pitch for American Wrestling Story. And so season 1 is very much going to focus on, or each season is going to focus on a character, a different character in wrestling or a different person in wrestling. And I'm only going to pitch the first 3 seasons because those are the only 3 that I was able to fully think of ideas for very early on. So very much season 1 is going to be dedicated to the wrestler known as Ric Flair, because when I was looking up in the idea of Ric Flair, I'm having my notes on my phone, very much the idea of Ric Flair is such an interesting concept, and I've even joked many times where I was saying, man, I can't wait for them to make a Ric Flair movie, because Ric Flair seems like the most obvious person to have as a movie, like a full-on fictionalized movie. And since they're about to do a movie about the Von Erichs, the wrestling family known as the Von Erichs, I thought it was only a matter of time before they do a Ric Flair movie. And then I got it thinking, and I was like, man, actually, I feel like a season or show on Ric Flair would be a lot more interesting and make it sort of like a mini-series in that case. And originally I was only going to have 8 episodes, but then I thought about the American Crime Story and American Horror Story format, which is 10 episodes a season. So that's very much what we're working with. Each season is going to be 10 episodes, and season 1 is going to be about Ric Flair. In the season, like The People vs. O.J. Simpson or Asylum and all that, it will be titled The Nature Boy, which is the moniker that Ric Flair very much has. And the first 2 episodes dedicated to Ric Flair will be the very much early story of Richard Fleer, his real name, and sort of the rise of Ric Flair, and sort of before he became the popular star that he is today. And sort of the final episode will the second episode is very much going to end where we get to the point where he does adopt the nickname and the moniker of the Nature Boy. And then we get into episodes 3 and 4, which will be Peak Flair, which is Ric Flair as the NWA champion and sort of the height of his career, which would be in the 1980s, and sort of that's when we would see the wheeling, stealing, jet flying, the entire thing, his entire catchphrase that he does. And that's when we would see him wearing the suits. It's sort of like the debut of the Four Horsemen, the popularity of Ric Flair, him going to all these different territories and defending the NWA Championship, his rivalries with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Dusty Rhodes, his entire thing with Sting in the 80s. Like, we would see sort of the most popular years of Ric Flair in episodes 3 and 4. And then episode 5 is when we get into the 90s, where we sort of see his star sort of, like in the, or at least episode 5, it would be the first half of the 90s, where he would sort of go away from WCW and the NWA and go into WWE, where he had this entire thing of, because in real life in the early 90s, I can't remember who it was, but whoever was running WCW at the time did not like Ric Flair, wanting him to shave his head and go by a different name, but Ric Flair didn't like that, and so he went into the WWE, and the episode 5 would sort of be that time period that we would see him in. And then episode 6 would sort of be the late 90s, where he's back with WCW, and sort of the latter, like, sort of the decline of peak Ric Flair would happen in episode 6. And then episode 7 and 8 would him be going back to the WWE post WCW. And also around this time, this is when we would start seeing a different actor play Ric Flair. And that's sort of the theme that I want to go. I would want 2 actors to play the main characters in each point. Maybe not season 3, but we'll get there. I'll tell you why when we get there. But sort of the first 5 episodes would be a younger actor. Like, when I say younger, I mean like 20s to 30s, playing Ric Flair in that time. And then when we get to episode 6 on, it would be an actor who would be playing the latter years of Ric Flair when he's getting older and such. And so episode, let me double check, 7 and 8 would be very much the not decline, but sort of when Ric Flair is starting to go away from the limelight. And it would even end, episode 8 would even end with his match against Shawn Michaels in 2008 at the WrestleMania at that time, where he retires from wrestling. And that's how that storyline would end. And then episode 9 and 10 would be, at least episode 9 would very much him trying to keep the glory that he has, and sort of like the decline of Ric Flair and him wanting to keep the popularity that he has. And even though he still has that popularity, it would be him still trying to grasp at the glory days that have very much passed him. But then episode 10 would be him fully accepting that he needs to move on. And even episode 9 would deal with the rise of his daughter, Charlotte Flair, as a main staple of women's wrestling in WWE. And then episode 10 would end with, this would sort of be the end of the season with the last match of Ric Flair, or Ric Flair's last match that happened actually in July in Nashville this past year of 2022. Don't want to date myself, but I very much need to specify that just in case someone watches this video later on in time. And that's how season 1 of American Wrestling Story would end with Ric Flair's final match with Andrade El Idolo in his corner, which is his son-in-law, versus Jeff Jarrett and his tag team partner. I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Jay Lethal. Don't quote me, but I think that was the team. But yeah, that's how it would end, and that's how the story would end with season 1, known as The Nature Boy. Now, season 2 is a little bit more focused on someone. But season 2 of American Wrestling Story would be titled Hulkamania, and it would be about the life of Hulk Hogan. And very much the first 2 episodes, again, you sort of see the format of the first 2 episodes sort of start with the early years of this person, and then we get all the way to the final 2 episodes being like sort of the final parts of that person's career. And the first 2 episodes, again, early Hulk Hogan in the 1970s, but then when we get to episodes 3 and 4, when we get into the 80s, that's when we see the rise of Hulkamania fame, of Hulkamania running wild on everyone. Again, because Hulkamania really started in 1985, so it would be like the early 80s would be him going into WWE, and then episode 4 would very much be Hulkamania at its peak. Very much. And then we get into episodes 5 and 6, where episode 5 would start with late 90s or early 90s Hulk Hogan ending his time with WWE. And episode 6 would very much be dedicated to the NWO era Hulk Hogan, where he's the biggest heel in all of WCW, Hollywood Hulk Hogan, and even start going into his decline of leaving WCW, because late 90s WCW and early 2000s WCW was not a great few years for WCW. But then episodes 7 and 8 would be Hulk Hogan's return to WWE. And episode 7 would very much be centered around the fact of the WrestleMania 18 match of Hulk Hogan versus The Rock. It would sort of be building up to that moment to be the climax of that episode. And episode 8 would very much deal with the latter part of him trying to keep that popularity sort of throughout like the 2000s, but then it's sort of leaving. And episode 9 would very much be the scandal that came out with Hulk Hogan of him saying the racial slur and his entire popularity sort of disappearing and people not really caring that much about Hulkamania anymore, or Hulk Hogan. And episode 10, the finale of season 2, Hulkamania, would be a little bit more depressing than the Ric Flair one, because it would be him like being accepted back into society, like the fallout and people sort of forgiving him, but also it would still leave that stale taste of Hulk Hogan and not many people caring that much about him anymore because of the racist slurs that were said by him. And though people still think of Hulk Hogan in the fond memory of everything he did, there is still a very large contingent of people that really don't care about Hulk Hogan anymore and very much only think about what he said at that period and cannot forgive him for that moment. And that would sort of be the way the season would end, about seeing a man that's trying to still claim the fame that he had all the way back in the 80s and the 90s, but people not accepting it that much anymore. And so we now get into the final season that I have planned out in my head, season 3, which would be labeled King of Memphis Wrestling, which would be about Jerry Lawler, who was very much the king of Memphis Wrestling. And I need my phone more in my lap this time so I can get a better idea. And so season 1, or the first 2 episodes of this season, would be about his early time, him getting trained and sort of becoming the star that he would later become, that he would later be known as. And that's sort of him. The second episode very much would be more important to these 2 episode arc, where it's him and his feud with Jackie Fargo, the man who trained him, where Jerry Lawler would be crowned after beating him in multiple matches, crowned the King of Wrestling. Not the King of Memphis Wrestling. At the time, he was the King of Wrestling. And so episodes 3 and 4 would him very much be claiming that title for himself and very much going on a run where he was champion, like the heavyweight champion almost everywhere in Mid-South Wrestling, and he would defend it everywhere. He would have these multiple feuds with Bill Dundee and Johnny Valiant and just all these feuds that he had, and that would be sort of episodes 3 and 4, and him carrying himself as the champion of the Mid-South territory. And episodes 5 and 6 would very much be the decline of Memphis Wrestling, sort of the late 80s and the early 90s, where Vince McMahon has been taking up all these territories, and that's sort of where we see Jerry Lawler sort of descending into the relevancy of Jerry Lawler going down, because Memphis Wrestling isn't sort of what it was because of the territories going away. And then we get into episode 7 and 8, where it would focus on the late 90s and early 2000s or like just the 90s, maybe more so the 2000s and 2010s time, where it's Jerry Lawler becoming the main Raw commentator and sort of the main struggles he's had being the Raw commentator, because a lot of the stuff he said as the Raw commentator weren't that well received, and especially he was more responsible for saying a lot of the raunchy stuff in terms of commentary with what the women were reacting to, and sort of he was the heel commentator of Raw, so he didn't have that much of a filter. I'll just say that. He didn't have much of a filter. And so episodes 9 and 10 would deal more of the older age, and as my dad described it, too dumb to quit. Because Jerry Lawler, even as I speak in his 70s, still wrestles in local independent production, in independent wrestling promotions, and sort of we would still see that would sort of be the final 2 episodes. And even his time when I believe he ran for mayor of Memphis and wasn't successful, we would focus a little have a little bit of an episode focus on that in episodes 9 and 10, but also it would mainly just be like the idea of someone that doesn't want to give up the relevancy that he had and sort of still going and going and going, but ultimately the idea of he is still wrestling and he very much needs to quit because he's in his 70s at this point. He's around close to the same age as my dad. So he very much, that's the idea of the final 2 episodes. And I know like season 2 and season 3 are a little bit more of a downer compared to how season 1 ends, but that's sort of the story of wrestling in general when you get older. But for the most part, that is my pitch for at least the first 3 seasons of American Wrestling Story. What are your thoughts on the pitch? Also, if you liked this as season 1, 2, and 3, what are some of your pitches for maybe season 4 or season 5? Post them in the comments down below about some wrestling personalities that you would love to see have their own season dedicated to them. And even like have a little season title for them. There are some obvious ones that I purposely didn't want to mention because they have like documentaries about them. For example, Macho Man Randy Savage, I purposely didn't have a season dedicated to him because they have an entire episode dedicated to him in the documentary series Dark Side of the Ring. And that's also the same with Chris Benoit, who I really wanted to dedicate a season to, and I really wanted to do the research and really work on a season with him. I even had it, like, I wanted to call it the Rabid Wolverine as well, or the Crippler or something like that. But again, in the same documentary series Dark Side of the Ring, they had a 2-part episode dedicated to Chris Benoit. And I also didn't want to do a series on Bret Hart or anyone that would slowly be related to the Montreal Screwjob, just because I don't want to do an episode on the Montreal Screwjob in the season, because everyone knows about the Montreal Screwjob at this point if you are a wrestling fan. If you're not, then maybe that would be a great season for you to get an idea of what happened at that one point. But overall, like, these were the 3 seasons, these were the 3 people I wanted dedicated to, like, the first 3 seasons, because Ric Flair is sort of like an institution when it comes to wrestling. Like, everyone knows who Ric Flair is. And for the large part of the 80s, he was sort of the indie, not the indie darling, but when you wanted to talk about wrestling and what it meant to be a wrestler in the 80s, you always watched a Ric Flair match. If you want, when it comes to Hulk Hogan, who was another staple of the 80s, he was very much someone that if you wanted to talk about WWE in general, you talked about Hulk Hogan. And then Jerry Lawler, who, again, for me, is just a local wrestling celebrity, because, again, I live in Tennessee. He was like the main guy of Memphis. And so yeah, I wanted to very much have those 3 who were like staples in wrestling at the time. And so yeah, that was my pitch for American Wrestling Story. What were your thoughts on the pitch? Again, if you also have people that you would want seasons dedicated to, I would love to hear them in the comments down below. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts on what you thought of this. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Were you indifferent to it? Whatever your thoughts are of this episode of Pitch This, post them in the comments down below. I really love doing a TV show pitch. I want to try to do another one too, because though I love doing movies, I love talking about TV shows as well. And also, if you really like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. That way you can be up to date with all the videos I have on my channel. Also, hit the notification bell. That way you can be notified whenever a new video like this comes your way. Until then, until next time, I have been Mr. EliMac. You've been the audience, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.